Crimson Manor. London was a city of mysteries, where old buildings held secrets older than the streets themselves. But among them, the Crimson Manor stood out as an enigma, an estate that had swallowed its inhabitants into its dark history without a trace. I was drawn to the house not by supernatural curiosity, but by necessity. My name is Daniel Carter, a freelance journalist struggling to find a story that would set my career back on track. When I heard about a Victorian manor in the heart of London that had remained abandoned for decades, I knew I had found my subject. Every article about the house hinted at tragedies, families moving in and mysteriously disappearing, owners leaving without explanation, strange figures seen in its tall windows at night. It was the kind of place that whispered to the darker corners of one's mind. The manor itself was an architectural masterpiece from the 1800s, with intricate carvings along its grand entrance and windows so large they seemed to be watching rather than letting in light. The locals avoided it. Some crossed the street when walking past. Others simply refused to acknowledge its presence. A real estate agent I contacted told me in hushed tones that the house was up for sale at an absurdly low price, but no one wanted it. "This house has history," she said, reluctant to elaborate. I dismissed her concerns. Every old place had a history. That was the point. On the evening of my first visit, I arrived at the manor just before sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and red, casting long, eerie shadows across the facade. As I pushed open the wrought iron gate, it creaked as if protesting my presence. The air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of a place long forgotten. Inside, the house was a testament to a time lost. Velvet drapes hung in tatters. An enormous chandelier loomed overhead, its crystals dulled by years of neglect. Dust coated the grand staircase, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional settling of the old wood. As I explored, I found remnants of lives once lived here, children's toys abandoned in a corner, a cracked mirror reflecting a distorted image of myself, a dining room set for a dinner that never came. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt an unsettling presence, a sense that the house was observing me rather than the other way around. Then came the first sign that I was not alone. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, I heard it, a whisper, faint and unintelligible. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate. I turned, scanning the corridor, but there was nothing there. My heartbeat quickened as I strained to listen. Another whisper. This time, it was closer. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Every rational thought in my mind told me to leave. But something else, something irrational, urged me forward. I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, its back facing me. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, peeling to reveal what seemed to be writing underneath. As I stepped closer, I realized the words were carved directly into the wood beneath the wallpaper. Names. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Then I saw it. Among the names, freshly etched into the wall, was mine. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse pounded in my ears. Someone had been here. Someone had been expecting me. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Then the whisper returned, Clearer this time. Right behind me. You shouldn't have come. The door slammed shut. I lunged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. My eyes darted around the dimly lit room, searching for another exit, but there was none. The air grew heavier, charged with something unseen yet undeniably present. The chair in the center of the room creaked, moving slightly. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" My own voice wavered, barely more than a whisper. A moment of silence stretched. Then the whisper returned, now forming coherent words. "We see you." I spun around, pressing my back against the door. The wallpapered walls seemed to pulse, shifting as if something beneath was pressing outward. A shadow flickered at the edges of my vision, but whenever I turned my head, it vanished. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from nowhere. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to move. To think. The names carved into the wall. Who were they? Past victims? My breath came in shallow gasps. The oppressive feeling in the room grew stronger, as if invisible hands were reaching for me. Then, something ice-cold brushed against my arm. I screamed and shoved myself away from the door, my shoulder colliding with the chair. The impact sent it toppling to the ground, revealing something underneath it, a small wooden box. My trembling fingers reached for it. As soon as I touched it, the whispers stopped. The air turned deathly silent. With shaking hands, I pried the box open. Inside was a bundle of old photographs. My stomach twisted into knots as I flipped through them. Each one showed a different person standing inside this very room. Their faces contorted in expressions of horror. Their eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared straight at the camera. And the last photo, it was of me. I dropped the photos, my vision swimming. That was impossible. I had never been here before today. Had I? The silence in the room was suffocating. My own name, carved freshly among the others, stood out like a death sentence. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch the etching, feeling the roughness of the wood beneath my fingertips. How had it appeared? Who had done this? Then, the whisper returned, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." My breath hitched, and before I could react, the temperature plummeted. My exhale formed a mist before me. Though no window was open, the walls groaned as if the house itself was breathing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs locked into place. Then the chair in the center of the room scraped against the floor, moving on its own. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the darkness. I turned sharply, but there was nothing but shifting shadows. My rational mind fought for control. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps a draft, an illusion of the dim light. But my gut knew better. Something was here. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept its beam across the room. My pulse pounded as the light revealed something I hadn't noticed before. A mirror on the far wall. Its surface cracked like fractured ice. And in it, a reflection that was not my own. A tall, thin figure stood behind me, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a silent scream. I spun around, nothing. But in the mirror, the figure took a step forward. Panic took hold, and I bolted for the door. It wouldn't budge. I yanked the handle with all my strength, but it was as if the very house refused to let me leave. My breath came in frantic gasps. My mind clouded with fear. Then, something cold wrapped around my wrist. I cried out, jerking my arm back. The pressure released, but the sensation of icy fingers lingered. I turned back to the mirror, and my stomach twisted in horror. The figure was gone, but my reflection no longer moved with me. Instead, it stared, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. Then, slowly, it lifted a hand, pressing it against the glass. The gesture sent a jolt of understanding through me. It wanted out, and it wanted me to take its place. I did the only thing I could. With a surge of desperate strength, I hurled my flashlight at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards spraying across the floor. The moment the reflection disappeared, the door behind me burst open with a deafening creak. I didn't look back. I ran, down the hall, down the stairs, and out into the cold night. The manor loomed behind me, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. Only when I reached the street did I dare turn around. The house was silent, still, as if it had never been disturbed. But as I gasped for air, trying to steady my pounding heart, I saw it. In the window of the room I had just fled from, a shape stood watching. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. And though I couldn't hear it anymore, I knew what it was whispering. You shouldn't have come. The hollow penthouse. New York City never sleeps. But on the 33rd floor of the hollow tower, silence ruled. I had always been skeptical of urban legends. But when I saw the listing for a luxury penthouse priced absurdly low, my curiosity got the better of me. As an investigative journalist, I had spent years chasing real stories, not ghost tales. But something about this apartment felt different. The rumors surrounding it were persistent, tenants moving in and vanishing, strange sounds in the middle of the night, and shadows that didn't belong to anything living. The hollow penthouse had been vacant for almost 2 decades. Until now, the moment I stepped inside, a heavy stillness pressed down on me. The space was lavish, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, sleek furniture, but it felt wrong, like a stage set designed to hide something underneath. The real estate agent, a woman named Ms. Harrington, refused to stay inside for long. She handed me the key and left so quickly that I barely had time to ask why. That first night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the city lights beyond the glass walls. At exactly 3:03 a.m., I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It came from the front door. I sat up, heart pounding. The building had top-tier security, and no one could reach this floor without clearance. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Nothing, just an empty, dimly lit hallway. Then the knocking came again, louder this time. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, expecting to catch someone messing with me. But the hallway was deserted. No movement, no retreating footsteps, only the faint hum of the city below. Something was wrong. As I closed the door, my eyes landed on the floor. A single, wet footprint, bare, human. I checked my own feet, dry. The air conditioning was on full blast, making the apartment cold. No one should have been barefoot outside my door. The footprint led toward the living room, fading as it went. I turned on every light, searching the apartment. There was no one there. No unlocked windows, no hidden passageways, but the unease in my gut grew stronger. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself I had imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, or maybe a maintenance worker had passed by earlier. I spent the next day researching previous tenants, but records were sparse. The last listed owner had left in 2004. No forwarding address. Before him, another had only lasted 6 months. A pattern emerged. No one stayed longer than a year. That night, I set up cameras. I wanted proof, not just eerie feelings. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, the cameras picked up something. A shadow, not cast by me, not by anything in the room. It moved, slowly, deliberately, and then, it turned toward the camera. There was a face, pale, hollow, watching me, and then it whispered my name. I ran, but no matter where I turned, the apartment didn't seem to end. The hallway stretched impossibly long, doors leading to places that shouldn't exist. The penthouse wasn't just haunted, it was alive. I collapsed against the farthest door I could find. Gasping for breath, my chest felt like it was being compressed, as if unseen hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. My fingers clawed at the handle, desperate to escape, but when I pushed it open, I found myself right back in the penthouse living room. The city skyline gleamed beyond the glass windows, mocking me with its normalcy. But inside, nothing was normal. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The air smelled different now, like burnt wood and something rotten. Something decayed. The television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, but beneath the crackling noise, a voice whispered. At first, I thought it was just interference. But then the whisper grew clearer. It repeated my name, over and over, until I could no longer convince myself that it was an illusion. Then the screen changed. A video played, grainy security footage of a man standing exactly where I was now. He looked confused, terrified. He turned toward the camera, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear. Then, suddenly, something dark rushed at him from the corner of the screen. The video cut to black. I stepped back, my entire body trembling. The knocking returned, this time rapid, insistent. It wasn't coming from the front door anymore, it was coming from the walls. I pressed my hands against the cold surface of the glass windows, trying to find some grounding in the chaos around me. And then, from the reflection, I saw it. A figure stood right behind me. Not in the room, but in the reflection. It was me, but it wasn't. The reflection grinned, lips stretching unnaturally wide, eyes black as voids, its hands pressed against the other side of the glass, mirroring mine exactly. And then, it stepped forward. The air inside the penthouse had changed. It was heavier now, filled with a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My heart was hammering as I backed away from the screen, where the shadowy figure had whispered my name. I replayed the footage, hoping it had been some trick of the light. But the whisper was unmistakable. I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was an investigative journalist, and this was my story. If I fled now, I would never know the truth. I forced myself to stay another night, I set up the cameras again, adding motion sensors and a backup power source. I double-checked the locks, ensuring the front door was secure. I even placed a line of salt along the threshold, an old superstition I had read about but never truly believed in, until now. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it was not just at the front door. It came from inside the apartment. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my breath shallow as I followed the sound. The knocking grew louder, coming from the hallway leading to the master bedroom. I hesitated before stepping forward. "Who's there?" My voice was barely a whisper. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched between me and whatever was in the darkness ahead. Then, just as I thought the worst was over, a slow creak echoed through the penthouse. The bedroom door was opening, on its own. I raised the flashlight and aimed it at the gap between the door and the frame. The light flickered, the batteries draining far too quickly. A cold dread settled into my stomach as I pushed the door open further. The room was empty, or so I thought. Then I saw it. The floor-to-ceiling mirror on the far wall no longer reflected my image. Instead, it showed something else entirely. A woman, gaunt, hollow-eyed, her mouth twisted in silent agony. Her pale fingers pressed against the glass, as if trying to escape. I stumbled back, but her reflection moved forward, closer, her lips parted, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, in a voice that was both distant and right beside my ear, she spoke. "Let me out." My phone slipped from my grasp as a cold wind surged through the room, whipping the curtains into a frenzy. The mirror cracked, a jagged web of fractures spreading outward from where her hand had pressed. The air was thick with static, and I felt a force pulling at me, dragging me toward the glass. I fought against it, grabbing the doorframe, my fingernails scraping against the wood. The whispering voices swirled around me, rising to a deafening cacophony. And then, everything went still. I gasped, finding myself sprawled on the floor of the living room. The mirror was intact. The door to the bedroom was closed. Had I blacked out? Dreamed the entire thing? But then I saw the camera footage. There was no recording of me entering the bedroom. Instead, the footage showed me standing in the middle of the living room at 3:03 a.m., staring at nothing, whispering to something unseen. And then, I turned toward the camera. My eyes were not my own. Something had looked through me. I left that morning, abandoning everything inside the penthouse. I never returned, and to this day, I still hear the knocking at 3:03 a.m. The Phantom Loft, Paris, France, a city of light, love, and hidden secrets. Deep in the heart of the Marais district stood an aging building. Its once grand facade now weathered by time. The topmost floor, a dimly lit loft, had remained vacant for years, its reputation overshadowed by a lingering tale of madness and mystery. For decades, the Phantom Loft had been whispered about in hushed tones. Its former occupant, Julien Moreau, was a celebrated 19th century painter whose works had once been the talk of Paris. But as his fame grew, so did his torment. Moreau claimed that each night, a voice whispered to him, guiding his hand as he painted. His final works, horrific, twisted visions of shadows lurking in his own studio, were found hidden in the walls after his death. His body was never recovered. When Claire Dubois found the listing for the loft, she was enchanted. A perfect Parisian hideaway, rustic wooden beams, an expansive skylight, and the charm of an old artist's studio. The rumors surrounding the apartment didn't faze her. She was a woman of logic, a writer seeking solitude for inspiration. At first, the space felt peaceful. The golden glow of the Parisian skyline spilled through the windows, bathing the apartment in warm hues. But as the days passed, an unsettling sensation crept into Claire's mind, the feeling of being watched. It started subtly, a shiver down her spine, a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. She dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But one evening, as she rearranged the furniture, she noticed something peculiar, a hollow sound behind the wall near the fireplace. Curious, Claire pried at the wooden paneling. With a sharp creak, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were several dusty canvases, their surfaces concealed beneath layers of cobwebs. Heart-pounding, she pulled them out and set them against the wall. As she brushed away the dust, her breath caught in her throat. Each painting depicted the loft, its wooden beams and skylight unmistakable. But in every single piece, a shadowy figure loomed in the background, barely distinguishable from the darkness. One painting in particular made her stomach twist. It showed her standing in the very same room, but behind her, in the corner, a figure stood watching. That night, Claire struggled to sleep. The unease had settled deep within her bones. As the city hummed below her, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the images from the paintings. Then, just past 3 a.m., she heard it, a whisper, faint, almost like a breath against her ear. She bolted upright, heart hammering. The room was silent, yet the sensation lingered. She reached for the bedside lamp, but before her fingers could find the switch, she caught movement in the mirror across the room. A figure, standing, watching. Claire gasped, twisting around, but the room was empty. Shaken, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was there, wide-eyed and terrified, but just beyond her, in the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the night itself loomed. And then, the whisper came again. "You found them." Claire refused to sleep after that. She left all the lights on, even in the kitchen and the small, dim hallway leading to the loft's only bathroom. But the longer she stayed awake, the more the whispers began to change. At first, they were fragmented sentences, nothing more than stray murmurs in the night. But then, one evening, she heard something distinct, a voice murmuring her name. She tried to escape into her work, writing frantically, letting the rhythmic clatter of the keyboard drown out her fear. But it didn't help. The shadows in the corners of the loft seemed to stretch toward her, lengthening unnaturally. The air turned thick, and a sickly coldness began to settle in the space around her desk. Desperate for some semblance of normalcy, Claire invited her best friend, Lucy, over for dinner. As they sat on the floor drinking wine, Lucy laughed at the idea of the haunted loft. "That's just old Parisian gossip," she said, rolling her eyes. "People love a good ghost story." Claire nodded, forcing a smile. But deep inside, she knew something was wrong. Then Lucy stopped mid-sentence. Her face going pale, she pointed toward the mirror across the room. "Claire," she whispered, "why is there someone standing behind you?" Claire turned, her heart hammering. The room was empty, but in the mirror, the shadowed figure had stepped closer. Lucy screamed, dropping her wine glass, and Claire lunged forward, grabbing her friend's arm, dragging her toward the door. But before they could leave, a gust of icy wind slammed it shut. The whispers rose, overlapping, growing into a frenzied chant. The room darkened, and the air became so heavy Claire could barely breathe. The last thing she saw before the lights flickered and died was the figure in the mirror reaching out, its skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. The door refused to budge. Claire pounded against it, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Lucy's screams filled the loft, her nails biting into Claire's arm as the unseen force held them captive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, a chorus of unintelligible voices overlapping in a frenzied chant. Shadows flickered across the walls, writhing like living things, stretching toward them from every reflective surface. "Claire, do something," Lucy shrieked, her voice raw with terror. Claire's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. Then she remembered the paintings. With a sudden burst of determination, she lunged toward the canvases stacked against the wall. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the largest one free, the portrait of herself standing in the loft. A shadowed figure lurking just behind her. Her pulse hammered as she raised the frame above her head and smashed it against the floor. A hideous screech erupted from the walls, rattling the very foundation of the building. The temperature plummeted, an arctic chill filling the air. The whispering ceased all at once, replaced by a deep, guttural roar that reverberated through the loft. Then the room lurched. The floor tilted violently, sending Claire and Lucy sprawling. A deafening crack filled the space as every single mirror in the loft shattered at once, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. Claire barely had time to shield her face before she heard it, a horrible, wet sound, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. Lucy let out a strangled cry. Claire forced herself to look up. The figure in the painting was no longer a mere shadow. It was here. A grotesque, elongated form rose from the remnants of the broken mirror. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers tapering into claw-like extensions that scraped along the wood. The air around it warped, distorting reality as if the very fabric of the room was being pulled apart. It had no face, just an endless, yawning void where its features should have been. Claire scrambled backward, pulling Lucy with her, but the thing moved, its body flickering in and out of existence, shifting through the shadows like liquid. Every movement sent a wave of nausea rolling through Claire's stomach, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible way it slithered through the space. Then it spoke, not in words, but in the same whispering chorus that had plagued her nights. "You should not have destroyed it." A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the room. The walls trembled, the air growing thick and suffocating. Claire's vision blurred as an intense ringing filled her ears. She felt her body being pulled, as though something unseen was trying to drag her into the shattered fragments of the mirrors. Lucy's grip tightened around Claire's wrist. "Run," Claire snapped back to reality, adrenaline surging through her veins. She lunged for the door, this time feeling it give way beneath her touch. She and Lucy stumbled out into the hallway, their ragged breaths echoing in the narrow corridor. Behind them, the loft shuddered violently, as if the entire building was trying to collapse inward. Then, silence. They didn't stop running until they reached the street below, the cool night air shocking their senses. The lights of Paris glittered around them, the distant hum of the city a stark contrast to the horrors they had just escaped. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Claire's hands trembled uncontrollably, her mind reeling. Lucy finally broke the silence. "You have to leave that place." Claire nodded numbly, but something inside her knew this wasn't over. That night, Claire refused to return to the loft. She checked into a small hotel on the other side of the city, her body aching with exhaustion. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the entity, the way it moved, the way it whispered, the way it had pulled at her very being, trying to drag her into the abyss. At 3 a.m., her phone rang. The screen displayed, "Unknown number." Claire's blood turned to ice. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. But some morbid curiosity made her answer. Silence. Then, beneath the static, she heard it, a whisper. "You belong to us now." The line went dead, heart hammering. Claire turned toward the hotel mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The room in the mirror was not the hotel. It was the loft, and behind her reflection, barely visible in the darkness, the shadowed figure stood waiting. Claire opened her mouth to scream, but the light flickered and everything went black. Forsaken Tower, Tokyo, Japan, a city of endless lights, cutting-edge technology, and deep-rooted superstitions. Nestled within the bustling metropolis stood Shinriku Tower, a high-end residential skyscraper that boasted luxury living. But despite its reputation, whispers surrounded one particular floor, a floor that no one dared to rent. Despite the tower's high demand, the 17th floor remained eerily empty. The few who had attempted to live there never lasted more than a week. Rumors spoke of phantom figures in the hallways, strange noises in the dead of night, and the most chilling tale of all, a mass murder that had occurred there decades ago. Its records mysteriously erased from public archives. The official reports claimed nothing had happened, but the building's cleaning staff knew better. They spoke of elevators stopping on the 17th floor without being called, security cameras picking up shadows moving where no one should be, and walls where faint, bloody handprints appeared, only to vanish when touched. Enter Kenji Takeda, a popular urban exploration vlogger known for seeking out Japan's most haunted locations. His channel, Ghost Atlas, had gained thousands of followers eager to watch him explore forbidden and cursed places. When Kenji heard about the Forsaken Tower, he knew it was the perfect opportunity. No one had ever spent more than a night there, let alone documented it. Determined to be the first, he secured a lease on apartment 1704, a corner unit with a panoramic view of Tokyo. Despite the warnings from the landlord, who practically begged him not to take the room, Kenji moved in with his camera equipment, ready to unveil the truth. For the first 3 nights, nothing happened, or so he thought. Kenji's first live stream from the apartment was uneventful. He walked through the halls, tested the elevator, and even spent an hour in the hallway at 3 a.m., hoping to catch something strange. But the only eerie presence was the suffocating silence that filled the floor. Then, on the 4th night, things started to change. His camera picked up something he didn't notice at the time, in the reflection of the glass balcony door. A faint figure stood behind him in the apartment. By the time his viewers pointed it out in the comments, the live stream had ended. That same night, his bedroom door creaked open on its own. Kenji, ever the skeptic, set up multiple cameras to capture everything. He was determined to prove whether the stories were real. On the 6th night, the elevator malfunctioned. Kenji was returning from a convenience store run when the lights inside the elevator flickered violently. The buttons became unresponsive, and just as panic set in, the elevator stopped at the 17th floor, even though he hadn't pressed the button. The doors opened to a pitch-black hallway. The air was dense, thick with the scent of iron and decay. Kenji stepped forward, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The walls, they weren't the same as before. The pristine, modern wallpaper was now stained with dark, crusted streaks resembling old blood. Then came the whispering, a chorus of voices, overlapping, murmuring in ancient Japanese. Kenji's camera shook as he turned around, to see the elevator doors slamming shut behind him. Then, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. A door creaked open, and something stepped out. Kenji's breathing turned shallow as he lifted his camera to focus on the end of the hallway. His screen showed something distorted, a figure. But not entirely human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its face was obscured in shadow, and yet Kenji could feel its eyes on him. The whispers grew louder, the voices cascading into a deafening wail. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered, illuminating glimpses of movement on the walls, handprints, shifting shadows, something crawling on the ceiling. Kenji stepped back, but as he did, his camera glitched, the screen distorted, the image breaking apart into static and incomprehensible symbols. And then, the figure charged. Kenji screamed as the weight of the presence bore down on him. He turned to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body resisting movement as if trapped in molasses. The hallway stretched, impossibly long, the doors along the corridor warping, twisting. A pair of hands reached out from the walls. Kenji's vision blurred. Then, darkness. Darkness. Kenji's world turned void, sight, sound, sensation. All vanished in an instant. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering against his ribs. The air was thick, cloying, suffused with something rancid and metallic. Then, a whisper, not just one, but many, a chorus of voices, speaking in hushed, fragmented Japanese. He strained to listen, his mind struggling to decipher their murmurs. Why did you come? Too late, can't escape. Join us, stay, forever. A sharp clang rang through the space. And suddenly, the darkness peeled away. Kenji was back in the hallway, sprawled on the cold floor, the camera still clutched in his trembling hands. The shadows moved along the corridor walls, flickering unnaturally as if alive. He scrambled to his feet. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had creaked open just before the blackout, now stood wide open. Beyond it lay nothing but pitch-black emptiness. And then, the footsteps began. A slow, deliberate shuffling echoed through the corridor. Kenji's pulse spiked as the sound drew closer, creeping toward him with a dreadful patience. He lifted the camera to his face, peering through the viewfinder. The screen flickered. Static overtook the display, the shapes warping and bending. And then, in the frame, he saw it, a figure, grotesquely thin, its limbs elongated beyond human proportions. Its face was an abyss, a featureless void that seemed to devour light itself. The mouth, a gaping, jagged slit, twitched, forming an unnatural, grotesque grin. Kenji's body locked in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee down the corridor. But his legs felt cemented to the floor. The entity took another step. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that moved on their own. Then, it lunged. Kenji screamed, hurling himself backward. His camera hit the floor with a sickening crack. The entity was inches away, its breath like ice against his skin. Desperate, he scrambled toward the elevator, his only escape. The elevator's betrayal. He reached the button panel and slammed his fist against it. Nothing. The buttons flickered, but the elevator doors refused to budge. Behind him, the whispering voices rose in intensity, overlapping in a nightmarish cacophony. His head throbbed from the overwhelming noise. The lights blinked out entirely. And then, a single, blood-red light flickered to life above the elevator. The floor indicator, which had been stuck at 17, began to shift. 16, 15, 14. Kenji's eyes widened in horror. The elevator was descending on its own, leaving him behind. A frenzied scream tore from his throat as something grabbed his ankle. He kicked blindly, but the grip was like iron. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around his leg, dragging him toward the open door at the end of the hallway. The entity didn't need to chase him, it was pulling him toward the abyss. Into the room where the shadows moved on their own. Kenji's fight for survival was a blur of terror. His nails clawed at the floor, his breath ragged and desperate. But just as he felt himself being swallowed by the darkness, the elevator doors opened. A surge of adrenaline gave him the strength he needed. With one final, desperate yank, he freed himself and lunged forward, tumbling into the elevator just as the doors began to close. The whispers erupted into a screeching wail. The last thing he saw before the doors sealed shut was the entity standing in the hallway, watching him with its horrific, unnatural grin. Then, silence. Kenji collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The elevator descended rapidly, carrying him away from the cursed floor. He fumbled for his camera, barely able to hold onto it with his shaking hands. When the doors opened to the ground floor, he didn't hesitate. He ran, out of the building, out into the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, where life still existed. That night, he deleted everything. Kenji never spoke about what happened in Shinriku Tower. His subscribers noticed his sudden disappearance. His social media accounts went dark. No new videos, No explanations. A few weeks later, his landlord visited apartment 1704 to collect the abandoned belongings. What he found made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in deep claw marks, as if someone had tried to escape. And in the middle of the room, scrawled in dark, dried blood, were the last words Kenji had recorded before vanishing. "It's watching." The Mirror House, Berlin, Germany, a city that thrived on contrasts, where history and modernity intertwined seamlessly. Nestled in the heart of a bustling district stood an architectural marvel that had puzzled residents and tourists alike for years. A house made entirely of mirrors. It reflected the world around it, warping the reality of passers-by and making them question whether they were seeing the real world or an illusion crafted by the house itself. For decades, the Mirror House had been abandoned. The last known owner, a renowned illusionist named Erich Kaufmann, had mysteriously vanished. Legends spoke of his obsession with reflections, with the idea that mirrors could reveal something more than just a person's image. His experiments had led him deeper into the realm of the unknown, until one day, he simply disappeared. No body was found, no signs of a struggle, just an empty house filled with endless reflections. When Daniel and Rebecca Wagner first saw the listing for the Mirror House, they were mesmerized. The idea of living in such a unique home in the heart of Berlin was too tempting to resist. Despite the eerie rumors surrounding it, the couple dismissed them as nothing more than local folklore. The house was a masterpiece, sleek, modern, and surreal. Every wall, every surface was covered in mirrors, making the space seem infinite. Even the floor had sections of glass that reflected the ceiling, creating a dizzying effect. Despite its striking beauty, there was an unsettling quality about it, something that neither Daniel nor Rebecca could quite put their finger on. The first night in their new home passed without incident. They celebrated with wine, marveling at their reflections that seemed to stretch into eternity. But as days went by, they began to notice strange anomalies, small at first, but increasingly disturbing. Rebecca was the first to notice something was off. One evening, as she walked past the large mirror in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of her reflection lagging behind her movement by just a fraction of a second. She froze, staring into the glass, but everything seemed normal again. Shaking off the unease, she told herself it was just her imagination. Daniel experienced his first unsettling moment a few days later. While shaving in the bathroom, he noticed something peculiar. As he moved his razor down his cheek, his reflection hesitated before mimicking the action, just by a millisecond, but enough to be noticeable. He blinked, leaning closer to the mirror. His reflection blinked twice. Chilled to the bone, he stumbled backward. He tried to laugh it off, convincing himself he was just tired. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The couple started paying more attention to their reflections. The more they observed, the stranger things became. It wasn't just delays anymore. Sometimes their reflections would stand still while they moved. Or worse, moved when they remained still. One night, Rebecca woke up thirsty and headed to the kitchen. As she passed the large mirror in the living room, she saw her reflection standing there, watching her with an expressionless face. She gasped, jumping back, her heart pounding. The moment she blinked, the reflection snapped back to normal, mirroring her every move. She barely slept that night. Things escalated when Daniel decided to test their theory. He set up a camera in the bedroom, pointing at the full-length mirror across from their bed. The next morning, they reviewed the footage. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until they reached the 3:14 a.m. mark. In the footage, both of them were fast asleep, but in the mirror's reflection, Daniel's reflection sat up in bed, turned its head, and stared directly at the camera. They stopped watching, desperate for answers. They began researching the house's history. They found old reports of Eric Kaufman's disappearance, articles about his obsession with mirror illusions and alternative dimensions. One particular account from an old assistant of Kaufman's chilled them to their core. He believed that mirrors were not just reflections, but doors. He wanted to step through to the other side. I think he succeeded. It was then that they noticed a new anomaly. The mirrors were no longer just mimicking them. Sometimes, their reflections seemed independent, and sometimes, they weren't alone in the reflections. The last straw came one evening when Rebecca, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, watched in horror as her reflection smiled at her, but she hadn't moved a muscle. She screamed. The scream echoed through the vast, reflective chambers of the house, sending a wave of shivers down Rebecca's spine. Daniel rushed into the bathroom, his eyes wide with alarm. "What happened?" he asked, panting. Rebecca pointed at the mirror, her hand trembling. It smiled at me." Daniel frowned and turned to the mirror. Their reflections stared back, seemingly normal. But something was different. Their reflections were still panting, as if out of breath, even though they had already calmed down. Daniel grabbed Rebecca's hand and pulled her out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of their heavy breathing filled the silence, and the realization that they were no longer alone in their own home sank in like a stone in water. Determined to find answers, Daniel searched through the house, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. Rebecca, too frightened to be alone, followed closely behind. As they moved through the house, something unsettling began to happen. Some reflections refused to move. In the dining room, Daniel paused. The reflection of the table, chairs, and chandelier all looked correct, except for one thing. Their reflections weren't there. "No, no, no," Rebecca whispered, gripping Daniel's arm. "This isn't real." Then, from the corner of their eyes, they saw something move. One of their reflections stepped out from a mirror across the hall and vanished into another. That was enough. They needed to get out. They ran for the front door. But as they reached it, something horrific happened. Instead of seeing the door's reflection behind them, they saw themselves standing in the reflection, grinning. Daniel grabbed the doorknob and twisted it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Rebecca pounded on the glass walls, screaming for help, but the only thing she saw in return was her reflection calmly watching, tilting its head curiously. Panic set in. Their reflections weren't just mimicking anymore. They were sentient, desperate. Daniel grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the closest mirror. It shattered into 1,000 shards. But instead of revealing a wall behind it, there was only more glass, an infinite corridor of reflections stretching endlessly. Rebecca gasped, stepping back. "We're trapped." From within the broken shards on the floor, something stirred. A hand reached out from one of the shards, pale and skeletal, clawing at the edges of the fractured glass. Daniel grabbed Rebecca's wrist and yanked her away just as a distorted, elongated figure began crawling out of the shattered mirror. There was no escape. The mirrors were no longer reflections, but doorways to something else, something beyond understanding. Their reflections stepped forward, moving differently than their real selves. The Rebecca in the mirror leaned close to the glass, pressing her hand against it. But instead of being solid, it rippled like water. Then she stepped through. Rebecca screamed as her reflection took her place in the real world. The imposter turned to Daniel, smiling with something that was almost human, but not quite. Daniel backed away. "No, no, you're not her." The fake Rebecca tilted her head. "Aren't I?" Then, without another word, she grabbed Daniel's arm with ice-cold hands and pulled. Rebecca woke up on the other side. The world inside the mirrors was dark, colorless, and silent. Shadows moved on their own, stretching and twisting unnaturally. She turned, looking for Daniel, but he was gone. Instead, she saw him standing in the real world, looking at her through the glass, his expression frozen in horror. She ran toward him, pounding on the glass, screaming his name. But he didn't move. He didn't hear her. Then she saw it. The real Daniel was still there, but his reflection had changed. The thing that had taken her place grinned, reaching out to hold Daniel's hand. Rebecca screamed as she watched the imposter lean in and whisper something into Daniel's ear. And then, he turned and walked away, leaving her trapped forever.